Today we're going to break down a really important legal case. It all starts with a heartbreaking accident on a provincial road, but it ends up answering a huge question for public transportation. When a tragedy happens, who's really on the hook?
So, picture this. The date is December 19th, 1986. It's a Friday afternoon, about 3 o'clock, in Mabini, Batangas. It's a day that's about to change a lot of lives, and not for the better.
A terrible crash leaves 2 young men dead and a whole lot of other people injured. And in the middle of all that grief, the family starts searching for answers, for justice. But the central question, the one that would take years to sort out, is the one we're looking at today. Who has to pay?
All right, so let's get into the specifics. What exactly went down on that road in Batangas?
Okay, so here's the setup. You've got 2 vehicles. First, an owner-type Jeep driven by a young man named Dolor, heading toward Anilao. And coming from the other direction is a public passenger jeepney, driven by Juan Gonzalez and owned by Francisco Hernandez. They collide, head-on. The result? It's just devastating. Dolor and his passenger are both killed, and in the other jeepney, the driver and his passengers are all injured.
Well, after an outcome like that, you can bet the families of the victims weren't just going to let it go. They went to the courts, and that's what kicked off this long, complicated legal fight to figure out who was truly at fault. The battle lines were drawn pretty clearly. The families of the victims argued that Juan Gonzalez, the passenger jeepney driver, was negligent. And really importantly, they said his employers, the Hernandezes, were also negligent because they weren't supervising him properly. The owners, on the other hand, said, no, the other driver was the reckless one. But here's their killer argument, the one they hoped would get them off the hook. They said Juan Gonzalez wasn't our employee at all. He was just leasing the jeepney from us.
And that single argument, that the driver wasn't really an employee, well, it all hangs on a very common practice in the Philippines. This brings us to the first huge legal question the court had to tackle. This right here is the million-peso question. I mean, if Gonzalez was just renting the vehicle for the day, the owners might be able to walk away. But if he was their employee, then they were responsible for his actions. So, what was the deal?
It all came down to this thing called the boundary system. You've probably seen it a million times. The owners claimed Gonzalez paid them 150 pesos a day. He gives them that fixed boundary, and any money he makes after that is his to keep. The owners argued this was a simple lease agreement, but you know the court saw things very differently.
And this quote right here, it gets to the absolute core of the court's decision. They ruled that the boundary system does create an employer-employee relationship. And why is that? Well, think about it. If owners could just lease out their jeepneys and wash their hands of any responsibility, it would be a total disaster for public safety. You'd have drivers rushing around, driving recklessly just to make their boundary, and victims would have no one to hold accountable. So the court said, nope, he's an employee.
Okay, so the court establishes the driver is an employee. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. The owners, the Hernandez spouses, they had another card up their sleeve. They argued, hey, we weren't even in the jeepney. How can we be held fully responsible for what happened?
So the owners pointed to this law, Article 2184 of the Civil Code. It basically says an owner is on the hook with the driver if they're in the vehicle and could have, grabbed the wheel or yelled a warning. Since they weren't there, they argued they shouldn't be fully liable. But the court came back and said, wrong article. The law that actually applies here is Article 2180, which is crystal clear. Employers are liable for the damage their employees cause while on the job. Period. Doesn't matter if they're there or not.
So how did the court build this case against the owner? It was basically a 3-step legal chain. First, they called the crash a quasi-delict, which is just a legal term for a wrongful act that causes damage to someone else. Second, like we just saw, they used Article 2180 to say the employer is liable. And then, the final link, they brought in Article 2194, which makes that responsibility solidary. Now, solidary just means they are both 100% responsible. The victims can demand the full payment from the driver, or from the owner, or from both.
So with liability finally sorted out, the court had to face its next and maybe its most difficult task, trying to put a price tag on a tragedy. I mean, how do you even begin to calculate the cost of all that loss and pain? The court awarded a couple of key types of damages. First, you have moral damages. This is for the suffering you can't put a receipt on, the grief a parent feels when they lose a child. Then there are temperate damages. This is for when you know there was a real financial loss, like a destroyed jeepney or medical bills, but it's just impossible to prove the exact amount down to the last peso.
This chart is really interesting because it shows how the awards for the Dolor family were adjusted by the higher court. The funeral expenses were actually cut down to what they could prove with receipts. But look at the moral damages. They jumped by 5 times, from 20,000 to 100,000 pesos. The court basically recognized the immense pain of losing a son. They also added those temperate damages we talked about. And you'll notice the attorney's fees got deleted, and that's because there wasn't a specific legal justification for awarding them in the first place.
So after all those years, the legal battles finally came to an end. A verdict was reached. But the impact of this one case, this one decision, goes way beyond the people involved. It sent ripples through the entire public transportation system that we still feel today.
And this is really the big takeaway, right? Why are we digging up a case from 1986? Because every single time you hop on a jeepney or a bus or get in a taxi, the legal protections that were strengthened in this case are there, working to keep you safe.
So what's the legacy here? What did Hernandez versus Dolor really give us? First, it made it law that boundary system is a job. It's an employer-employee relationship. Second, it slammed the door on owners trying to escape responsibility. They are fully on the hook for what their drivers do, whether they are in the vehicle or not. It sends a clear message that public safety is number one, and you can't use lease agreements as a loophole. And finally, it reinforces the idea that the law is there to make sure that when the worst happens, victims and their families have a clear path to justice. And that's a legacy that protects every single one of us.